So good
Right.
afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Journal Club. Today's session, identifying pregnancy outcomes in real-world data remains a complex challenge, and it raises an important question. Can we truly rely on algorithms to accurately capture these outcomes? Well, today Sabrina Giometto will present and lead the discussion on the paper Developing and Refining the Pregnancy Algorithm Certainty Tool, ACE, for validating pregnancy outcomes by Singh and Xiaoqing Huang and others. She will walk us through how the ACE tool was refined and guide us in reflecting how the challenge and considerations when using algorithms to identify pregnancy outcomes in real-world data. And before proceeding to give the floor to Sabrina, let me tell you that Sabrina Giometto is an economic statistician by training and recently obtaining a PhD in clinical and translational science from the University of Pisa in Italy, with a thesis focused on the secondary use of data sources in pharmacoepidemiology. She also completed a specialization in healthcare statistics and biometrics at the University of Pisa. She has been working in pharmacoepidemiology for 7 years and has recently focused on developing algorithms to identify pregnancies and related outcomes using secondary healthcare data sources. So, Sabrina, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Martin, for introducing me and for inviting me at this journal club. So today we'll talk about algorithms for pregnancy outcomes in real-world data. And the presentation will focus on this paper, and the title is Developing and Refining the Pregnancy Algorithm Certainty Tool for Validating Pregnancy Outcomes. And the study was published on August 2025. So let's start by understanding what is the ACE-IT tool and the rationale for adapting the tool to pregnancy. So what is the ACE-IT tool, Algorithm Certainty Tool? It is defined as a qualitative tool to evaluate an algorithm for use in a particular situation, so a very general definition. And the aim of such tool was to enable to support regulators to appraise whether a given algorithm based on real-world evidence is fit for purpose for a specific decision context. So let's fix two definitions provided by the authors in the paper. So first, algorithm defined as phenotyping, that is the process of variables construction, and fit for purpose, that is defined as a conclusion that the level of validation associated with a medical product development tool is sufficient to support its context of use. So basically, the ACE-IT tool consists in a list of items, so it is a checklist, and those items are classified in 3 different domains. The first domain is the one of internal validity, and it includes 24 items. Then there's the second domain for external validity, including 7 items. And then the third and last domain for ethics and transparency that includes 3 items. And a note is that ischemic stroke was selected as safety outcome to motivate the development of this tool. So let's get a bit more in the detail, and let's have a look at some examples of items included in the tool. And we'll see one item per domain. So starting from the first domain of internal validity, one item included in the tool is, are the operational definitions or the index algorithm of the outcomes of interest clearly defined and described? For the second domain, for external validity, one of the items included is the index validation study location and setting for inpatient, outpatient, emergency, and other settings clearly described and appropriate for measuring the outcome in the target population. And finally, for the last domain, which is ethics and transparency, one of the items included is, was the validation conducted according to a pre-specified protocol, which is also registered, and changes to the study documented in a protocol amendment. So now we come to the why. So why the ACE-IT tool has been adapted into the pregnancy ACE-IT? Well, because it is well known that observational studies on pregnancies are fundamental, as data on pregnancy women from clinical trials are limited. And also, according to a review published in 2022 on PDS, there's a poor reporting of methodological elements in pharmacoepidemiologic studies in pregnancy. So the authors of this paper consider that developing a tool to reliably and consistently evaluate algorithms on pregnancy outcomes was imperative. And here I reported some challenges that are specific and unique for algorithms for pregnancy outcomes. And they are the assessment of different outcomes. So we don't have one single outcome, but there could be pregnancy-related outcomes, birth outcomes, mother outcomes, and also the heterogeneity of data sources for mothers and infants, and finally, the necessity of a mother-child link. So now we can move on to the pregnancy ACE-IT, and we'll start by looking at the development process. So we said that first it was developed the ACE-IT tool, and then the authors considered that there was a need to adapt that tool to pregnancy. So this development process consisted in 4 different stages. And the first stage of the development process to construct the pregnancy tool, in this stage, 6 experts in perinatal pharmacoepidemiology were involved, and they provided input on developing a vignette to support the development of the pregnancy ACE-IT. And we can read a summary of the vignette to understand it. So a sponsor has been asked to conduct a post-marketing safety study for the risk of neural tube defects among live birth infants exposed in utero to novel drug X compared to comparator drug among pregnant persons with inflammatory bowel disease. And the sponsor would like to determine whether the index algorithm for neural tube defects developed by Carbanda et al., so included in this paper 2021, is appropriate to use in their study, which will use this data source, which is the Innovation in Medical Evidence and Development Surveillance, IMEDS. So the experts that has been involved in this process, they drafted this vignette and they identified the outcome of interest, an index algorithm, and a target data source. So let's have a look more details for each of these elements. So for the outcome, neural tube defects are serious birth defects of the brain and spine happening very early in pregnancy, and fetal surgery may occur before birth, and however, the diagnosis would likely still be recorded at birth. And also data for infants will be collected for up to 1 year after birth to allow adequate follow-up time to detect neural tube defects. Some details on the index algorithm to identify the outcome of interest. So the index algorithm an algorithm for measure structural birth defects, and it was based on ICD-10 CM codes. It was validated using medical charts as reference standard, and PPV was computed as a measure of accuracy. And finally, the algorithm was developed in the vaccine safety data link. So this was the validation data source. And finally, some more details on the target data source. So IMEDS, that includes information on enrollment, demographics, pharmacy dispensing, medical encounters, diagnosis, and procedure data. And it is representative of the commercially insured population in the United States, including 125 million patients. And it is considered one of the largest distributed databases with mother-baby linkage. So let's move, we had a look at the first stage of the development process of the pregnancy tool. So let's move to the second stage. In this stage, pregnancy-specific concepts were incorporated into the ACE-IT tool, for example, mother-baby linkage, pregnancy start, gestational age. And on the right, we have an example of a table of summary of modification. So for example, here we have item number 2 of the entire checklist reported that is related to data source. And we can see that there's feedback of the experts, and they, related to this item, they suggested to add a statement about mother-baby linkage, including both the percentage of linkage and the methods for linkage. But we'll go deeper in this item in a moment. So we move to the third stage of the process, where an assessment by external raters was performed. So at the beginning, 6 experts were involved to provide some input to adapt the first version of the tool into the pregnancy one, and then a different group of external raters were invited to use the pregnancy ACE-IT tool to determine whether the index algorithm was fit for purpose for the target study or not. And the external raters were also asked to assess the feasibility, acceptability, and appropriateness of the pregnancy tool. And there's a note that the assessor should identify a priori the key items relevant for their fit for purpose assessment before answering the other items in the pregnancy tool. And finally, we have the fourth and last step of the development process, where all the experts' feedback were reviewed and summarized. So a percentage of agreement on whether the expert considered the index algorithm fit for purpose for the target study was computed, and the pregnancy ACE-IT was finalized. So now we can have a look a bit more in detail at the pregnancy ACE-IT tool and specifically at its content. So we said that the pregnancy ACE-IT tool consists in a checklist of 34 items. So we have the full checklist on the left, and of course it's very small, so we can't read it. And I tried to select some of these items that could be more interesting. So the first item of the checklist that I selected is item number 2, and it belongs to the internal validity domain. So we said that the checklist is divided in 3 domains: internal validity, external validity, and ethics and transparency. And items number 2 belongs to the internal validity domain and specifically to the data source subsection. And this item says, are the validation data sources adequately described and relevant and reliable to validate the index algorithm? So the authors consider that this item was included to determine the relevance and the reliability of the data source, and a clarification sentence specific to pregnancy has been added at the end. That is, for each data source, the study should describe the proportion and threshold of linkage, and the study should also assess the variability of linkage by each contributing source, if applicable, and over time. And also the study should compare the characteristics of the linked and unlinked population in justifying the threshold for linkage. So for these items, the elements to consider are assessment of relevance of the data source, assessment of reliability of the data source, a description of the type of data source is an administrative data source, an administrative data source augmented with the electronic medical records, and also the description of key data elements, so exposure, outcome, coding system, study periods, and then the description and assessment of quality assurance and quality control procedure, including data transformation and data linkages in case it was applicable. The description and assessment of the impact of missing and miscoded data or data lag on completeness and accuracy of data. And finally, a description of data linkage, including mother-baby linkage, methods, and accuracy. So let's move to another item of the checklist. This is item number 3, and it still belongs to the internal validity domain, but it is part of the study population subsection. And it says, are inclusions and exclusions of study participants in the index algorithm validation study adequately reported and justified? So the authors included this item. As we know, the inclusion and exclusion of participants may result in a selection bias, and this may influence accuracy measures. And also a specific explanation related to pregnancy has been added also for this item, and is the one highlighted in light blue, saying that pregnancy outcome validation studies should clarify whether pregnancy episodes and start date were identified based on electronic healthcare data recording during the prenatal window. For example, gestational age was calculated by the healthcare provider relying on self-reported last menstrual period, or it was estimated based on recorded services as ICD-10 CM codes. So the elements to consider for item number 3 related to study population are: have primary sources of inclusion and exclusion been identified? So selection bias, information censoring. The statement of the number of excluded participants should be reported. A description of the reasons for exclusion and whether these were pre-specified should be present. Assessment of the impact of excluded participants on the validation study result, an attrition flow diagram, and finally a description of the characteristics of excluded cases. We can move on to another item of the checklist of the pregnancy tool that is still part of the internal validity domain, and in this case it belongs to the study outcomes subsection. And it says, did the index algorithm validation study report whether the outcome was incident or prevalent? And the author included this item because the incident or prevalent nature of the outcome may affect the measures of accuracy. And also in this case, consideration specific for pregnancy has been added. For example, in this case, for studies in pregnancies, the concept of gestational diabetes versus pre-existing diabetes, or gestational hypertension versus pre-existing hypertension should be considered. So the elements to consider for this outcome, for this item related to study outcomes, are that validation outcomes should be described as incident or prevalent, and then a look-back period needs to be defined to determine the incidence nature of the outcome. We can move to another item included in the checklist, item number 11. This item belongs to the study design and setting subsection of the checklist, and it explores whether the time period of the index algorithm validation study was appropriate for measuring the outcome. And the authors consider that the time period and duration of follow-up should be reported in the index study to determine whether it was appropriate for measuring the outcome. And specifically for pregnancy outcomes that are dependent on pregnancy start or gestational age, these concepts should be clearly specified, because differences in their specification may generate different estimates of accuracy. There's a mic open.
Yeah, sorry, Sabrina. I think Karim has a microphone open. I don't know if he can hear us. Oh, thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, regarding this item number 11 of studying design and setting, the elements to consider are then the assessment of the appropriateness of the time period of the index algorithm validation study, and if applicable, there's a need for a clear definition of pregnancy start or gestational age, and again, if applicable, assessment of the impact of changes in measurement methods during the time period of the index algorithm validation study should be reported. Let's move to item number 15. That belongs to the subsection of statistical methods. And it says, does the study report on relevant accuracy parameters and data to support quantitative bias analysis to assess for misclassification of outcomes when applicable? So the authors included this item because potential misclassification of an outcome can, of course, impact the measure of association and the interpretation of results. And the authors suggest to consider a quantitative bias analysis in the validation study as a sensitivity analysis to show whether and how the outcome misclassification might affect study results. And therefore, in case a quantitative bias analysis was performed, accuracy measure should be reported in the validation study in order to be used for the quantitative bias analysis. And also the authors underline that what should be considered, the degree of misclassification, whether the misclassification was differential or non-differential, whether the misclassification was dependent or independent, and finally, the direction toward which the association between exposure and outcome might be biased. And finally, a specific clarification related to pregnancy has been added also to this item. That is the last one highlighted in light blue. And they say that the majority of existing published studies on maternal fetal outcomes don't report on sensitivity, specificity, and negative predictive values, precluding a quantitative bias analysis. We can now move to another item, that is item number 16, and this item is part of the limitations subsection of the checklist. And it says, are the index algorithm validation study limitations, including misclassification, the impact of missing data, and the possible magnitude, direction, and uncertainty of bias, reported and addressed? And of course, the authors included the item because they believe that it is important to address the interpretation of the study in light of the limitations that are reported, and specifically for pregnancy, a clarification part has been added, that is for pregnancy studies, methods to identify pregnancy and or to determine the gestational age should be considered when interpreting the index algorithm validation study results, as they will influence the selection of the study population in the validation study and the accuracy of the operational definition. And also that for pregnancy studies, the accuracy of the gestational age based on diagnosis code versus ultrasound reports has been shown to vary over time. And this may especially affect outcomes that are defined by gestational age. So the elements that should be considered related to the limitation subsection and specifically to this item of the checklist are a description of measure limitation of the study, their influence on measures of accuracy should be reported and addressed, a description of the methods for assessing gestational age, such as by diagnosis code or ultrasound should be reported, and finally that sensitivity analysis should be considered. We'll move now to the last item that I selected within the checklist of the pregnancy tool. And this item belongs to the reference standard subsection of the checklist, and it explores whether the reference standard is relevant and appropriate to identify the outcome. And the authors consider that they included this item to check that the method used to determine cases was relevant, appropriate, and well documented in the study, and that the rationale for the choice of the specific reference standard should be appropriately justified when, in case more than one alternative exists. So the elements to consider that should be considered for the reference standard section are that a description of the reference standard should be sufficiently detailed to allow independent replication, and also that the assessment of whether the reference standard is relevant and appropriate to determine through cases should be present. And finally, that the rationale for selection of the specific reference standard in case there are alternatives should be reported. So now we can move to some results that were presented in the paper. So the final question to the experts was, is the algorithm fit for purpose for the specific context that was presented in the vignette? And among 27 participants, 60% of them considered, yes, the algorithm is fit for purpose for the specific context, and approximately 40% of participants consider the algorithm either unsuitable for the specific vignette or that not enough data were available. And also the experts highlighted some critics of the pregnancy ACE-IT tool. The first one was that using the pregnancy tool was time-consuming, that multiple concepts were in some cases combined for some items, and also that the fit-for-purpose assessing was not the focus of every item. So, for example, sometimes the completeness of reporting was the focus of the item. And also there was potential, there was space for subjectivity in some items. And moreover, additional examples relevant to pregnancy outcomes were needed for some experts. And finally, they also underline a lack of details on the target data source. The experts highlighted also some strengths of the pregnancy ACE-IT tool, and they are that it is a practical, structured, and detailed framework. They also underline the consensus achieved by experts and stakeholders in developing the tool. And finally, they consider it an aid to the development of their manuscripts. And the experts also highlighted some uses of the pregnancy ACE-IT tool beyond its initial purpose, which was to evaluate whether a given algorithm was fit for purpose or not. And these other uses were designing new validation studies, and also that the pregnancy tool could be helpful for preparing manuscripts for submission, and also as a support for new validation algorithms. So just to wrap up everything, we said that the ACE-IT tool that was first developed based on an ischemic stroke outcome was then adopted into the pregnancy ACE-IT tool. So it could be used to evaluate observational studies, and also that the pregnancy ACE-IT tool is a qualitative tool structured as a checklist to evaluate whether a given algorithm for pregnancy outcomes is fit for purpose for a specific context. And finally, the pregnancy ACE-IT tool evaluates the algorithm accuracy, the transportability, and the completeness of reporting.
Thank you very much, Sabrina.